Hello and welcome to this sixth episode of the Special Rugby League Coach podcasts, looking at different issues in the game. And everyone I do could be my last in case the business goes to another owner. But I've decided that I wanted to bring in a special guest for this one. Martyn Sadler is a long-time company chairman and managing editor of League Express. Martyn, first of all, how are you and how's the weather in the United
Fine. It's an Indian summer over here, Lee. We're in the middle of Yorkshire, and temperatures are due to rise to about 25 degrees today.
Ooh.
So in early September, it's great. And you can't see it, of course, but I'm wearing my shorts today, which I don't normally do in England. So I can't complain too much. It's nice to see a bit of sunshine as the season nears its climax.
No wonder you're so happy. Summer rugby, I suppose.
Absolutely. Which I promoted the idea of, by the way.
Oh, I'd love to talk
long before we actually switched to having summer rugby over here.
I'd love to talk to you about that as we are. I've no doubt. I've got little things to talk to you about, but I've known you long enough. I think we'll branch off into quite a few different directions. The thing that made me reach out to you, Martyn, I was surfing your website as I often do. I at least have a look at least once or twice a week, totalrl.com, for those who aren't familiar. And I read your Talking Rugby League column of the 30th of August, and the headline was Sky Sports TV deal represents decade of failure off the field. And my eyes and ears got excited by that, and I got straight into it. And I'll let you start, mate. Define what you see as a decade of failure off the field.
Well, the failure comes from the TV contracts themselves, or at least the TV contracts are a symptom of failure, because in 2014, the ex-chief executive Nigel Wood negotiated a £40 million a year deal with Sky Sports over 5 years. That ran until that was for a 5-year contract, actually, up to 2021. It was negotiated early, and it was a very successful negotiation by Nigel Wood. For this season and last season, 22 and 23, the payments from Sky dropped from 40 million per year to about 25 million pounds per year, a massive drop. And from next year, we've negotiated a new 3-year deal, and the figure then is going to be 21.5 million pounds a year. So it's a falling profile, in other words. And that really is just, as I say, a symptom of the fact that the people who run our sport in this country have not really they've not enjoyed any success in being able to market the game to a wider audience. And that's fairly simple. While other sports are finding that their broadcast contracts are on a rising curve, our sport is not. And I'll give you another sort of symptom of that. We had the Challenge Cup final last month, which is, traditionally, I mean, the Challenge Cup has been running since 1897. It's certainly the longest standing rugby league competition, or rugby competition, I think, of any sort in the world. We had the final between Hull Kingston Rovers and Leigh. Leigh won an absolutely thrilling game in golden point time, as you probably remember.
Yep.
There were 58,000 people there, just over 58,000 people. The cheapest ticket you could buy to get a seat there would be for 20 quid. On October the 1st, at the start of next month, there's an NFL game there, American football game, at Wembley at the same venue. It's sold out, and the cheapest ticket you can get is 100 quid. So, you've got a sport there that's selling out Wembley, that's got very little real connection with the United Kingdom. But because they spend an absolute fortune on their marketing approach to the game, they can sell tickets for 5 times more than we can and still sell out. And it just sort of tells you a lot about the lack of impact that our game makes, even though the Challenge Cup is actually shown live on the BBC, from the last 8 onwards. We don't seem able to take advantage of that exposure to draw a full house to, the national stadium in this country. We can only 2/3 fill it. And I think that's just, that fact itself condemns the way that our sport has been run for many years. And I'm not just blaming the people who run it now, because it's actually a symptom over many years. We've never spent money on marketing, have we, in rugby league? And frankly, I don't think you even do in Australia. The NRL does have the advantage of being the major game in New South Wales and Queensland. So in a sense, it markets itself, where we can't rely on that. So we've got to be far more intelligent and strategic in the way we promote the game if we're going to expand it. But the people who run it have never, they've never found a way to do it, and I'm not even sure they've ever tried to find a way to do it. The people who run the game are invisible, and you can even add on the fact that for the last 12 months, IMG have been involved in rugby league, but what's their contribution been so far? It's, in terms of marketing, it's extremely difficult to identify it, Lee.
There's quite a lot you've said there, and there's a few things I can sort of pull out and go in different directions. And the first thing that came to my mind, and I knew I'd have a plan of everything I wanted to talk to you about, Martyn, but you'd say something else that would send me on a different tangent. Now, you mentioned the NFL and you mentioned the price of the tickets. I would say the NFL in England is very much a television sport, because they only get to see one game a year or two games a year in the flesh at most. Did you know in New South Wales is quite a significant push to have the Super Bowl day as a public holiday?
No, that's fascinating.
From employers. Now, I believe in Australia, and I think you can link this a little bit to England as well, and I'm sure you can, and I'm sure you've got thoughts on it, and this is why I brought this in, that we actually make a big mistake as marketers or as a sport. We look in Australia and we go, right, that crowd in Brisbane was bigger than the AFL crowd, or that crowd in Sydney was bigger than the A-League crowd. We're actually looking at the wrong opponent. The opponent is what is on our TV screens, and I don't even just mean Netflix and Amazon and whatnot. I'm talking about EPL, English Premier League soccer, football, and the NFL and other similar sports like Big Bash and cricket. And I now bring you back all the way, and you might not be ready for this. This could be an 8-hour podcast, but did we not have our chance in the 90s around when Rupert Murdoch was trying to put his stamp on the game on both sides of the world?
Of course.
To become part of this TV movement. And now we've sort of missed the boat a little bit because of, I didn't agree with all the mergers, Martyn, but some of them made sense. I look at the Salford's, Travais, and I look at Oldham, and back then they were talking about merging as Manchester, and I'm sort of thinking to myself, well, could Manchester have done any worse than what those two have done over the last 30 years? And so did we miss the boat then? Do you think we took the wrong option as a sport?
Well, I think mergers would have been an absolute disaster, Lee, for various reasons. But the main one being that rugby league as a sport is very tribal, particularly in this country. And, it's like the continuing debate over Cumbria. A lot of people say Whitehaven and Workington should merge. All you'd be doing by doing that is abolishing two weak clubs, two clubs that are undeniably weak at the moment, and creating one club that might be even weaker than either of them taken separately. Because you can only do that. You can only merge clubs. The only obvious example I can think of, actually, of merged sporting clubs in the UK is in Inverness, where Caledonian and Thistle merged to play football in that Scottish Highland city.
Did Wimbledon not merge with someone?
No, Wimbledon demerged. No, Wimbledon split actually into the current Wimbledon club, which is back playing at Plough Lane, which incidentally shares its stadium now with London Broncos. But the Wimbledon club itself actually moved to Milton Keynes, and it's now called MK Dons. So that was a demerger rather than a merger. One club became two clubs.
Can you remember off the top of your head, Martyn, what the original fee was that the late Maurice Lindsay negotiated back in 1995?
87 million was the figure. Yeah, 87 million over 5 years. It was initially 77 million, and then it went up to 87.
And is that 87 annually?
No, it was 87 million over 5 years.
Okay, all right.
No, it was 87 divided by 5, so that's 17.4 million annually.
So right now, in those terms, we're only a little bit ahead of that, aren't we? If in terms of
absolutely,
if every pound equaled the same, which obviously it won't.
Absolutely.
The next question I want to ask.
It's worth pointing out, though, Lee, to be absolutely fair to Super League and the RFL, the early deals with Sky Sports gave them exclusive rights over the game. The last deal, the deal we're currently playing out, and the new deal, do give Rugby League the right to have games on free-to-air TV. At the moment, that's 10 games per season that Channel 4 have covered. That Channel 4 will be covering a game this weekend, for example, on free-to-air TV. And from next year, I understand it will be 17 games per year. So if Channel 4 want to expand their coverage, they would be able to. Whether they'd be prepared to pay a fee for that right remains to be seen. Of course, there are some quite important negotiations to be carried out. But so in a sense, although Sky are paying less than they were in the deal that Nigel Wood negotiated, they have released some fixtures for other people to cover, for streaming or for free coverage on terrestrial TV.
You mentioned IMG briefly earlier. Did I read it on your platform that the clubs have ignored the IMG suggestion to minimise the fixtures and are staying with 27 next year?
The clubs still want 27 fixtures, which will include loop fixtures. I mean, if there weren't loop fixtures, there would be only 22 fixtures. 12 clubs in Super League would equate to 22 fixtures. IMG did recommend getting rid of those, and the clubs have quite frankly ignored them, at least for one season. Whether that remains the case in the following seasons, I'm not quite so sure. But that would, if they did do as IMG suggests, that would leave a lot of space in the fixture schedule for other things, whether international competition or whatever other competition that they might think of.
In real terms, and this will sort of link into performance in a way too, what does having essentially half the amount of money in the coffers, what will that mean for the professional rugby league player in a Super League club in England?
Well, it means the salary cap is the thing, isn't it? In England, the salary cap is more or less static. It's not rising. Yeah. I mean, it's quite interesting that it will remain roughly the same, despite the fall in central distribution from the Sky money. So clubs are going to have to find that money from somewhere else, and it's not clear where that will be. And you contrast that with the salary cap in the NRL, which is what is it this year? Something like I'm guessing.
I'm terrible with the figures, but I know it's heading north. Every few years it heads north.
Something like $12 million now, I think. Something like $12 million.
And what you can see with the flow of players, the English players are coming here now rather than vice versa. The players you're getting in the Super League some of them would struggle to get into state teams here regularly, which is market forces operating. On the subject of we talked briefly about off the field and marketing and whatnot. We tend to look at them separately, but they all impact each other. And we've just had a World Cup. I mean, I do sort of think that the off-field performance of the World Cup in terms of how many people attended games and the finances, I think that's been repeated ad nauseum. So I'd like to focus on the actual performances of the home nations in the World Cup. I was continually banging on my social media, and I felt like I was a lone voice at times, that I think there needs to be root and branch reform into how we are producing players to play rugby league in the home nations after basically half a century of failure. And you've been on this earth a little bit longer than me, Martyn, so you've had to deal with this a little bit longer than me in life, and I'm sick to my back teeth of England not we didn't even get to play Australia in this tournament. What do you think? I mean, will we ever turn in your lifetime?
Let me tell you a story about the World Cup last year. Illustrates the point about marketing that I said earlier. When you've got a major tournament like that, I think the World Cup was a real failure, not just from England's point of view, but from Rugby League's point of view.
Yeah.
And the reason is because it never caught fire, because there were far too many one-sided games in the group stages. People, we were asking people to pay quite a lot of money to come and see games which we knew were going to be one-sided. Now, I'll give you a little story. Back in that contrasts very sharply with what happened in 2013, the World Cup tournament that year, which actually drew bigger crowds than the tournament in 2022, despite the fact that the 2022 tournament was massively backed by central government, 25 million quid they contributed. There was a very big team organising the event compared to 2013 when the event was organised by a very small team. And yet the 2013 event attracted bigger crowds. And the reason for it, in my view, was because it was organised in such a way that it was going to deliver much closer games at every level. And I'll tell you why that was. Prior to 2013, a couple of years prior to it, I actually sat down with Nigel Wood, the then chief exec of the RFL, because Nigel had phoned me and said, "Can I come and meet you? I'd like your advice about how the World Cup should be organised." And I said to Nigel, "Look, Nigel, you can't have a tournament in which there are multiple one-sided games of 60, 70, 80 points, Australia playing, say, Russia or somebody like that, whoever it might be. You've got to organise it in a way that minimises those games." So I suggested to him, "Look, I'd like to see 16 teams in the 2013 tournament, but I'd like them to be organised in seeded groups." So I said to Nigel, the top 8 teams would be in 2 groups of 4, with 3 teams going through to the quarterfinals. Teams 9 to 16 would be in pools 3 and 4, and only 1 team from each of those groups would go through to the quarterfinals. And Nigel, to his great credit, took that on board. He actually didn't get 16 teams. We only got 14 teams. But nonetheless, the top 8 teams were in groups 1 and 2, and groups 3 and 4, which had 3 teams in each of them, they were teams 9 to 14. And what happened was that, you had the home nations like Scotland and so on playing against Tonga, playing against Italy, and drawing great crowds because they were playing in extremely competitive games. I think Scotland beat Tonga, or if I remember rightly, and drew with Italy, in Workington of all places. So but you contrast that with the 2022 tournament, and the people who ran it said that they were going to do away with that structure that had been so successful in 2013, and they were going to have 4 equal pools with Australia drawn against Scotland, for example, in the same pool. And they were going to play those games at big venues. In other words, no venue below 12,000 capacity. And I said to them, that's an enormous mistake. You don't want to have Australia playing Scotland. You want Scotland in the same group as teams like Jamaica and Greece and so on, and whatever. You really don't want what you're proposing, because you're asking people to come and pay big money to see these incredibly one-sided games. People won't do it. People just will not do it. No. And I'm sad to say that I was proved to be correct. And if they'd organised those pools in the way that I'd suggested, I think the tournament would have been far, far better supported and far more exciting as well.
And if you know rugby league and you know the players involved, it's not rocket science, is it? To allow teams to avoid each other, and
of course, in many sports you have seeding. I mean, tennis is obviously the example where you avoid your top players playing against each other until the final stages. And then that makes it all the more exciting. So, I'm afraid the people who ran the Rugby League World Cup fell at the first hurdle, in my opinion, because the fixtures, the way that you organise fixtures is absolutely crucial. Fixtures and venues are really crucial. And they failed, I'm afraid. And it was a massive missed opportunity.
One thing I want to do now for the next half of this pod is to focus on you and your role in the game for an awfully long time, and we'll unpack that. But first of all, I want to, again, link the story that I read last week and why it brought me to get in touch with you again. Because, as you know, I worked under Maurice Lindsay for a while, the late Maurice Lindsay. And Maurice Lindsay's already come up in this conversation as being the architect the English architect, if you like, of the Super League. And one thing he used to do every Monday morning, Martyn, was get on the phone to me and say, "What has Sadler written this morning?" You struck fear into him. So your publications and your newspaper, which you've been the editor of for a long time, has obviously made people at the top of the game quake in their boots. When did League Express start, Martyn?
1990. First issue, September the 17th, 1990.
So it's nearly its birthday. It's nearly its 43rd birthday.
I suppose it is. Yeah. When you put it like that, yes. Gosh, that makes me feel very old.
Sorry, hang on. 33. Terrible maths.
Yeah. Don't make me even older than I am.
There can't be many people that have been in one rugby league job at the top of that rugby league job for 33 years.
No, well, at the time, I actually was a university lecturer back in 1990. I actually started as a university lecturer in 1977. Yeah. And I spent 20 years doing it. I actually I had a foot in both camps for 7 years, from 1990 to 1997. But so I actually built a pretty solid career in a university context.
What did you teach?
Well, land economics, really, and that sort of field, and business economics. But it was funny, actually, because back in 1997, I'd been there for nearly 20 years, and the university went through one of its periodic financial crises and offered people the chance to, move on, and they paid me a year's salary in advance without me.
Was that because Blair scrapped tuition fees?
Well, that something like that.
Because that's when he came into power, wasn't it? 97.
But that's when I ended. I walked out of the university on a Friday afternoon in March 1997, and on the Monday morning I was here, at my desk in League Publications office. So it was a very easy transition.
So essentially, it was a part-time hustle for you for 17 years.
It had been, yeah, it had been, and I'd advise anybody actually to do what I did within their own context, because, pursue a career that will pay you reasonably well to set you up for life, but at the same time pursue a hobby that you can later on turn into a.
That's exactly what I did. That's exactly what I did. Where did the spark for League Express? I mean, were you sat having a pint or a coffee with someone, and where?
I'll tell you, I used to. I found myself living next door to a guy called Tim Butcher.
Yeah.
Who was a Wakefield Trinity fanatic like I am, and one day back in 1988, I think it was, both of us were keen Wakefield fans, and there was one particular Sunday when Wakefield played at home to Wigan, I think probably in October '88, if I remember rightly. And Wakefield in those days was struggling in the way that Wakefield today is struggling. Some things never change. Mm-hmm. But that particular day, they beat Wigan at Bellevue. So the following day, as you did in those days, I went out and bought as many papers as I could to read about Wakefield's great win. And I found that all the rugby league journalists had been at another game. They didn't, the Wakefield win over Wigan got virtually no coverage at all.
Yeah.
And that night, Tim and I were in the pub together, and he'd done much the same thing as me. We both felt very frustrated, because when your team wins, you like to read about it. Mm. But we were sat in the pub, and we sort of had one or two pints together, and I think it was Tim who mentioned it first. Wouldn't it be good if there was a Monday morning paper dedicated to rugby league? And we both agreed it would be. And Tim had a pal who worked for a local newspaper at the time. And the interesting thing about it, in those days, it was the time when Rupert Murdoch had moved the Times newspaper to Wapping, and it basically smashed the print unions.
Yep.
What that did, it made producing a newspaper much more technological, much more, it done away with the old ways of doing things overnight. And suddenly the cost of producing a newspaper came cascading down, whereas nobody could have really, we couldn't have launched League Express in the era of the print unions, because the print unions wouldn't have allowed us.
Yeah.
You couldn't have, they had a monopoly over printing newspapers, at least. Mm-hmm. But then that was swept away by Murdoch, and suddenly it was possible to investigate whether it was feasible to produce a printed newspaper, by a small company like we obviously would be.
Mm-hmm.
And we checked it out and discovered it could be done. It's cutting a long story short, because it took us 2 years between that first thought to get our first issue out. It was an awful lot of preparation, very expensive build-up, and we invested quite a lot in terms of computing and finding people who could do it for us, because it was important to find somebody who could command the technology skills to be able to put something together and then send it down the line for printing. But we managed it in the end, and I always remember we actually. I spent quite a lot of time putting together a business plan and taking it to the bank who we're still with at the moment, and meeting the bank manager. And we gave him this very expensively prepared business plan that had been done by a very reputable firm of accountants. And he sort of flicked through it and threw it in the bin.
Lovely.
And I said, oh God, does that mean, because we were asking for a £25,000 overdraft facility, which was a lot of money in those days. And he said, no, the mere fact that you had that prepared tells me that you're serious about what you're doing. So I'll give you the deal, and you don't need to worry anymore.
There you go.
That was an interesting approach, I thought.
Yeah.
Which nobody would get away with these days, of course.
We're here now talking on Zoom, and we've both got our microphones and whatnot. Give the uninitiated a bit of a picture of what it would have been like, what this call would have been like. So, we wouldn't have been doing a podcast, number one. Let's pretend I'm a radio presenter interviewing you, and what kind of line would, I know the answer, but some people wouldn't. What would the line be like coming from Australia back then? And also, how easy was it for you to get hold of results from different places and get hold of different coaches and chairmen and whatnot?
Well, funnily enough, as soon as we launched, there was a guy in Australia called Malcolm Andrews who got in touch with us and said, could he send stuff down the line about the Australian game? And what you've got to remember in those days, Lee, that back then, if you wanted to watch Australian Rugby League, you had to get a video cassette sent over.
Yeah.
With Neil Cadigan was the guy who did that. Neil was a real great rugby league journalist from those days. And he would send over, material that you could then watch, obviously sometime after the event. So people didn't have ready access to Australian Rugby League here. And Malcolm, who was a great journalist and had a terrific style of writing, used to, take a page or two in the paper to give us all the, up-to-date score lines and reports and so on. And, he did a great job. And a lot of people really enjoyed what he did. Sadly, Malcolm died a few years ago now, but he was a great guy, a great friend of mine. And, we still miss him, really, if we're really honest about it. But but in those days, it was the time when, probably before emails had really been created. So we used to have to do things down the line, and all the match reports used to be phoned in. So we actually had typists sitting at their desk, just typing in match. It's horrendous now to think back to.
Well, I was in your office. I was in your office for 3 months in 1999 during the summer break from university, and that was still happening. Some journalists still operated like that, and then I went. Then I went to become a press officer in Super League, and in those 3 years, it very much went from press releases being faxed out, so everybody received a fax.
Absolutely.
And then a year or two later, a few would have an email, and that would be their go-to. And then by about the end of it, it was about 50-50. And then I imagine not long after I left Wigan, it would have been 100% email. So,
I'm sure. I still remember sending my first email as a university lecturer, back in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
We had these computers, computers then were becoming desktop things.
Yeah.
As opposed to the enormous things that were locked away in specialist computer facilities. We all started getting desktop computers, and of course, email came shortly afterwards. And I remember sending my first email to a colleague, and her emailing me back, a sort of jokey jokey type thing, and it was, I don't know if we all realised at the time how much that was going to change everybody's life, and
many people see email as old now.
Oh yes,
so anybody under the age of 30 thinks email is a slow way of communicating, where you can just message somebody through a social media channel.
I still like emails because I've had them now for so many years. If people message me on social media, I tend to say send me an email.
Yeah. And then you got into the realm of bringing out a second publication each week, didn't you?
We did, which lasted for a few years.
Yeah, so when I was around, it was Total Rugby League on a Friday, and it was a different material. It was a sort of glossier.
It was previewing the weekend as opposed to reporting on the weekend.
And it was also a bit punchier. It was a bit more fun, I'd argue. It was a bit more...
Probably
targeted at a bit of a younger audience, possibly.
Yeah.
What about the switch to going online? When did you... Well, I remember in 99 it being mentioned.
So we've had an online presence now, and you can read you've been able to read the digital version of League Express for many, many years. In fact, I can't easily remember the year in which it went that way. But nowadays, of course, you can't afford not to have a strong online presence, can you? It's changed so much, and of course, it's impacted upon sales of printed products quite markedly. And obviously, the height of our sales were, many years ago now, unfortunately.
It's funny that you've had the demise of League Week over here that essentially, from my memory, didn't even try to go digital. And I suppose it's a credit to yourself that you pivoted quite early into that space. What would you say was your favourite period as editor in terms of things that were happening in the game where you felt you were really... Well, I sort of mentioned earlier how powerful you were in terms of Maurice Lindsay's mind. So when did you think you were making a genuine difference, or where you felt you could make a difference? So what I'm trying to get at, you'd be there writing your editorial on a Sunday and you thought, right, if I write this paragraph, my phone is going to ring on Monday morning with somebody having when you think back, what was the most hostile or key time?
Well, the key time was when the game, when it had the Super League revolution, because I'd written for several years before that the game ought to switch to summer. So it was great to see that, that was coming about. And I also wrote very strongly. If you remember the first 2 years of the Super League era, 96 and 97, the champions were the team that finished top at the end of the season. Which was St Helens in both of those years. Again, some things don't change much. But I remember writing very strongly, for example, that it's about time we had a playoff with a grand final, so that the title of champions went to the winner of the grand final to make a massive event at the end of the season. And that came about too, and I was really pleased to see that happening. I think that's made a big impact, although it could have been even bigger, because we, again, like everything in our sport, we don't make the most of what it is, unfortunately. But certainly, that was the time when rugby league looked as though it was going to have a really great future, Lee, to be honest. And that, unfortunately, has never come about. And we could write a book on why that is, couldn't we, really?
We could write a book why that is, and I suppose it would be a good sequel to the book that's just come out, and we're not going to do a book serialization now, but Hope and Glory.
If you've seen our paper this week, I've just done a review of that book.
And you can get that online as well, the review, can't you? TotalRL.com. That book just makes you wonder how the hell are we not in a better place right now, but we could go on. I guess I'm going to pretend I'm talking.
Well, one reason why. Let me just explain one reason why. It's because the clubs themselves have too much influence in our sport. One of the things that I used to lecture about in university was a subject called business organization, and I always used to say to students and to people generally that it's perfectly possible for you to have the wrong organizational structure but still be successful. You can if you've got a great product to sell, you can sell it successfully, even if it's even if you're not organised in the right way to sell it. But it's so much easier if you've got the right organisational structure. And we've never had that. We've always had the clubs having, in effect, a power of veto over decisions. The right organisational structure is one that recognises that the competition is the economic unit that should be being promoted. And you see that, for example, the most successful example that I can point to, Lee, is Major League Soccer in the United States, where, you know, Major League Soccer is in effect, I mean, I won't describe its structure in detail now, it would take far too long, but effectively Major League Soccer, the central body is the major shareholder in all the clubs. So the central body dictates everything that the clubs are able to do. The clubs cannot dictate to the central body dictates to the clubs. Now, Major League Soccer, if you look at it, it started with 10 clubs in 1996. This year, it's got something like 30 clubs. So, in other words, it's grown, it's trebled in size in the same period since we've stayed the same. And now, if you want to set up a Major League Soccer club in any American city or even Canadian city to become part of that competition, you've got to pay millions and millions and millions of dollars, you know, maybe $200 million for the right to set up a club. They've been so successful that, it's effectively self-sustaining. And that's despite the fact that TV viewing figures for Major League Soccer in America are derisory. People don't watch it on. You've said it, you talked about a TV sport. Soccer isn't a TV sport really in the United States. Compared to the NFL or baseball or whatever, or basketball, soccer gets derisory viewing figures in America. What it does, it gets great crowds because, you know, there's a significant population in the United States, mainly perhaps the Hispanic population, for whom soccer, you know, a lot of recent immigrants from, you know, South American countries, Mexico and so on. For them, soccer is still part, you know, it's in their blood really. So they get great crowds watching Major League Soccer, but not great TV viewing figures. And you know, but nonetheless, those crowds of you know, they've got virtually every club has built its own stadium over there now, so specialist soccer stadiums, rather than having to use American football stadiums, and it's a thriving sport.
I'm going to wrap things up, but before we do that, I just want to answer some quick fire 4 questions for you, Martyn, to end it with a little bit of fun. In a moment, I'm going to make you the czar of rugby league in England, and you're going to make some big appointments. But first, I want you to reflect on a favourite or a famous front page of League Express or Total Rugby League that you were most proud of over the years, or that would stand out. If you had to just show one to somebody to sum up your career as an editor, which would be the front page?
I'll tell you the one that really got us going, right at the very start. The thing that really established us was when Great Britain beat Australia in the first test in 1990 at Wembley.
Yeah.
We had a front page then that showed British players with their fists in the air, pumping, and that was a great seller for us. And that made people go out and look for our newspaper. And once they'd done that, we were on a rising curve. So there's no front page, and you know, that's 33 years old. It seems odd to say, you know, a front page from that long ago. But without that, if Great Britain hadn't won that game, and we'd had to put another front page out that showed the Australians winning, and then winning perhaps the next 2 tests, I'm not sure we'd have even survived the first year of publication.
Wow.
So we actually, you know, so it shows there's a symbiosis between the game itself and our fortunes. And that certainly was true back then. And I'm forever grateful to Great Britain winning that game, because even though we didn't win the next 2 tests, the
next test was a belter. What about a scoop or a story? There must have been something that you uncovered in League Express as an exclusive that would have made the CEO of a club or the game ring you on Monday and say, "This is all rubbish, Martyn. What's this?"
Yeah, that's really an interesting one, actually. I wish you'd tipped me off before that you were going to ask about that one, because, you know, there've been quite a lot. And again, I think it's probably going back to the Murdoch days, you know, when we released, you know, got a lot of important exclusives with people at that time about where the game was going to go. The mergers, for example. I think we broke the news that mergers were were being proposed, and of course, thank goodness they never happened. I'm totally opposed to them. In fact, Lee, it's quite interesting to see the bottom two teams in the NRL this year. Just remind me,
the merged clubs. Are the merged clubs?
Two merged clubs. Yeah. St George Illawarra Dragons and West Tigers. Still not really worked after all that time, even though they both of those teams won the NRL in the intervening period since those mergers. But it never really worked in my view.
All right, last one before we go. You're now the chairman of the Rugby Football League, but you've been given all power to appoint a CEO who's going to run the game, and you want them to run a game because you're going to be on the Bahamas running the sport and just on the mobile phone talking to your CEO and a Great Britain or England coach. And it can be anybody from your time since being editor of League Express, so between 1990 and now. So any CEO or any coach to be CEO and coach.
Well, the first thing that I would do is to reorganize the Rugby Football League to make it like Major League Soccer. That's the first thing I would do, and I would force the clubs into agreeing to that, because without doing that, Lee, I don't think we're ever going to see significant expansion. I'd completely do away as well with different levels of the game here, promotion, relegation, which I think are absolutely.
What about the salary cap?
Relegation
what about the salary
absolutely cap? Disastrous. Salary cap. Well, I'd have salaries determined in Major League Soccer. All salaries are determined by the central body, and I'd do that here as well.
Yep.
So I would want to get the person I would appoint as the chief executive is the last person, or the person who currently runs Major League Soccer, and I'm not even sure who that is. But I'd want that person to come and run our sport, and I'd offer him all the money in the world to come and do it, because that's the model that I would want to see being applied over here. And in terms of a coach to coach England or Great Britain, I think I would go for Lee Briers, who's doing such an admirable job with the Broncos, and I think could do a great job. Although he might want to coach Wales, who knows? Because of course that's who he played for.
True.
But that's who I'd like to see.
Martyn, you have been an amazing servant to rugby league, and I'm pretty convinced there's not enough people probably tell you that. But you're talking.
Not many.
you're talking to a lad who couldn't wait for the newspaper every Monday, and of course there was a rugby leaguer as well. But you could tell even then, my young mind could tell even then that League Express was a better newspaper. It was, it was more detailed, organised, better, and whatnot. So you have been,
and hopefully had better opinions as well.
And long may it continue. Hopefully you and your business will be around for a lot longer.
Forever, hopefully. Yeah, you never know, do you? But if I can find a way to live forever, Lee, then it will be forever, probably. But I'm still working on that one, mate.
Take care.
Thanks a lot.